Story 1. The Hollow Circle in the Woods. I had been hiking the Blue Ridge backroads for years, but that morning I decided to try a trail I'd never seen marked on any map. The forest was quiet in that early hour, mist clinging to the low hollows, sunlight slipping in thin shafts between the pines. I welcomed the silence. It was rare to find a place untouched by hikers or hunters, but as I rounded a bend, the path opened into a clearing that made me pause. At first, it seemed ordinary. A small glade framed by tall trees, sun-dappled and serene. But something in the stillness felt wrong, like a note played out of tune. My eyes were drawn downward, and that's when I noticed the ground. Trampled in a perfect circle, the soil blackened in patches, as though a fire had been lit and smothered in a hurry. It wasn't a campfire, not really. Too deliberate, too precise. Around the circle I saw what I first thought were sticks and old twigs arranged by the wind. But as I looked closer, I realized they were something more deliberate, small effigies made from twigs, animal bones and bits of bark, carefully positioned in patterns that made no sense to me but clearly meant something to someone. My stomach clenched, a cold sweat prickling my skin. I took a cautious step backward, and a sound brushed my ears, soft and nearly inaudible at first. A whisper carried on the wind, indecipherable but distinct. I froze, convinced it was just the forest playing tricks on me. A low murmur of leaves and branches, but the sound persisted, growing slightly louder, a chorus of voices that weren't mine, echoing off the trees in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself the sound was wind through the pines, maybe an old animal call, but it didn't feel natural. Every hair on my arms stood on end as my eyes scanned the perimeter of the clearing. There was nothing, no one. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of unseen eyes pressing against the back of my neck. The forest that had seemed welcoming now felt claustrophobic, heavy, as if the air itself were watching me. I took another cautious step backward, careful not to disturb anything, and the whispers seemed to recede just enough to make me think I could leave safely. The hike back to my car was slow, deliberate. I didn't dare run. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the shadows where the trees pressed together most densely. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing, though I saw nothing. The further I moved, the more the forest seemed to stretch and shift around me. When I finally reached the main trail and my car, I paused to catch my breath, thinking I had left whatever had been in that clearing behind me. But the sense of being watched didn't lift. Even sitting in the car with the doors locked, the memory of those effigies and the whispered voices clung to my mind like smoke. Hard to shake, impossible to ignore. Later, when I mentioned the clearing to locals in the nearest town, they exchanged uneasy glances. One older man, his hands rough from a lifetime of labor, lowered his voice and told me quietly to stay away from the ridge at night. "Some folks keep to themselves up there," he said, "doing their rituals. They don't like eyes wandering where they shouldn't." Another, younger and less certain, warned me the full moon drew them out, and that anyone stumbling onto their work might not be welcomed. They spoke in hushed tones, as if saying the words too loud might draw attention, and I realized this wasn't a story I'd been meant to hear, but one I had heard anyway. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering returned in my dreams, not loud, not clear, but a presence pressing against my consciousness. I dreamed of the circle, the little effigies, the blackened patches of soil. I could see myself stepping backward, trying to escape, and feel the cold breath of something unseen brushing against my neck. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and the image of the clearing burned in my mind like a brand. I couldn't stop thinking about who had been there, or why, or what the precise arrangements meant. It wasn't just superstition, it was a human presence, deliberate and ritualized, something that had persisted in the forest long before I arrived and would persist long after I left. I returned to the area once, months later under the cover of mid-afternoon, hoping to prove to myself that it had been imagination, but the trail seemed different, unfamiliar, and when I found the clearing, it had been disturbed again. The circle remained, the effigies were there, but the arrangement was subtly different, as if someone or something had been actively maintaining it. I didn't linger. I turned and walked back, never looking directly at the patterns, never wanting to know exactly what had happened there, who had made it, or why. Even now, months later, I sometimes feel it. A cold draft on the back of my neck when I step outside. The sensation of being watched when I'm alone in the woods near my cabin. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, the eerie isolation of the mountains playing tricks, but deep down, I know it was real. I saw it with my own eyes. The hollow circle, the precise effigies, the whispering voices carried by the wind, and that knowledge, the knowledge that someone out there is still performing those rituals, still watching, still waiting, is something I can't forget. It lingers, a quiet dread that presses into the bones, a reminder that some parts of the mountains are not meant to be seen, or perhaps not meant to be survived untouched. Story 2. Lanterns flickering at midnight. I was driving a narrow, winding back road through the Blue Ridge Mountains that night. The kind of road that disappears into darkness between ridges and thick pine forests. The air was damp, the kind that sticks to your skin and fills your lungs with the scent of wet leaves and decaying earth. I'd been alone for hours, just me and the hum of my old car engine, hoping to catch the quiet of the mountains before night fully claimed them. That's when I saw them, faint lights flickering in the distance, bobbing in a way that made them seem almost alive. At first, I thought someone had left lanterns by a campsite, but the movement didn't match the gentle sway of fire. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder, my headlights cutting into the mist. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the glow cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. As I got closer, I realized the light was coming from a clearing I hadn't expected to find at all. A circle of open space surrounded by trees that seemed unnaturally still. And then I saw them, figures in dark hoods standing in a wide circle. They were swaying slightly, their movements slow and deliberate, accompanied by a low, rhythmic chant that sounded older than anything I could place. My heart slammed against my ribs, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something held me frozen. I pressed myself against a thick pine, hiding in the shadows, watching as one of the figures stepped forward. They carried a small bundle wrapped in rough cloth and laid it on a stone altar at the center of the circle. The bundle didn't move, but the weight of it seemed impossible to ignore, like it carried a story or a warning. The chanting continued, a low thrum in my chest, and I realized I could hear the rhythm of their breath, the careful articulation of words I couldn't understand. One of the hooded figures turned slightly, and for a brief, terrifying second, I felt the gaze pierce through the dark, directly at me. My stomach twisted, my pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt that instinctive freeze, every survival mechanism screaming at me to run. I didn't, at first. I couldn't. I was rooted by the impossibility of what I was witnessing, the certainty that I had stumbled upon something older than any town rumor or local legend I'd ever heard. Then, as quickly as I had arrived, it was gone. The lanterns winked out. The chanting ceased, and the clearing was silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees. I looked around in disbelief. The figures had vanished as if they had never existed, leaving only the smell of burning sage in the air and the small, abrupt tang of smoke from the extinguished lanterns. I stumbled backward through the underbrush, tripping over roots, my hands slick with sweat, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Every snapped twig seemed magnified, every rustle in the dark a possible presence. By the time I reached my car, my clothes were damp, my boots caked with mud, and my hands trembled so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. On the drive back down the ridge, the memory replayed itself in my mind, each detail more vivid than the last. The stone altar, the bundle, the cadence of their voices. All of it clung to me, a weight I couldn't shake. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see hooded shapes in the distance following me, but there was only darkness and the occasional reflection of the car's headlights on wet leaves. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that it was a trick of the mist, the isolation, maybe even fatigue, but I knew better. Something had been there, and it had known I was watching. In the days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I asked locals, cautiously, at first, about strange gatherings in the mountains, but most people shook their heads or muttered warnings. One old man leaned close and whispered about a group that performed rituals under the full moon, hidden deep in the forest, known only to a few and tolerated by the rest, out of fear. He didn't go into details, but I didn't need him to. I had seen enough to understand. The thought that they were still out there, somewhere in the misty hollows and ridges, performing acts I could barely comprehend, made my skin crawl. I still drive those roads sometimes, in the daylight, when the trees seem less oppressive and the mist lifts, but I never go near that clearing again. The memory lingers, the flicker of lantern light through the trees, the rhythm of voices not meant for me, the stone altar and the bundle. At night, when the wind shifts just so, I swear I can smell that faint trace of burning sage, carried on the mountain air. And I remember that moment of being seen, truly seen, by something that was very much real. It's a weight that doesn't leave you, a quiet dread that sits behind your eyes, a reminder that in those mountains some things are older and more deliberate than any of us, and that stumbling across them is a mistake you never fully recover from. Even now I sometimes wake to the faint impression of a chant in the distance, almost like a memory, almost like a warning. I can't explain it. And I don't know if I ever will. All I know is that night, that clearing, those lanterns, what I saw was real, and the knowledge of it is something that clings to you, quiet and insistent, whispering that you are never truly alone in the mountains. Story 3. The Cabin with Whispered Prayers. My friend and I had spent the morning following a barely marked trail deep into the heart of the Blue Ridge. The kind of path where sunlight barely reaches, and the forest floor is littered with rotting leaves and snapped branches. I'd heard stories of abandoned cabins in these mountains, and while I was skeptical, there was a curiosity I couldn't shake. By late afternoon, when the sun had dropped behind the ridges and the air grew thick with humidity, we stumbled across one. It was small, half hidden by encroaching underbrush and moss, its timbers grey and rotted, but it didn't feel entirely lifeless. Something about it pressed against the edges of awareness, a quiet insistence that we shouldn't be there. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy and stale, like the remnants of 100 winters trapped behind closed walls, but there was also an odd, almost intoxicating scent of herbs and smoke. I couldn't place it exactly. Sage, maybe, or some combination of dried plants. But it made the room feel alive in a way that made my stomach tighten. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the fading light from the doorway barely illuminated the room. Carved symbols lined the walls, some simple, others intricate, and scraps of paper with jagged, cryptic writing were nailed up at uneven intervals. My friend shivered and muttered something about superstition, but I could see the unease settling over him too. As we moved deeper into the cabin, a low murmur rose from the shadows, soft and rhythmic, like voices in prayer. My head jerked toward the sound, but the space was empty. No one moved. The murmuring continued, almost imperceptible at first, then rising slightly in urgency, but still without source. I felt my pulse accelerate, a mixture of fascination and terror rooting me to the spot. One scrap of paper caught my eye, pinned near the corner of the room, the handwriting trembling and hurried. "Do not disturb what sleeps here." My fingers itched to touch it, to see if it held some secret, but I couldn't bring myself to move closer. We explored in silence after that, stepping lightly across the warped floorboards, trying not to disturb whatever presence seemed to hang in the cabin. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind rattling through broken window panes felt amplified. I swear I caught movement in the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that vanished when I turned. My friend eventually suggested we leave, but I hesitated, drawn by the weight of the space, as if it had absorbed centuries of devotion, fear, and anger. There was a palpable history here, a record of quiet rituals, whispered promises, and some kind of longing I could barely comprehend. By the time we left the cabin, the sun had dipped completely, and the forest had grown darker, the path home twisted and overgrown. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the murmuring to follow, half expecting to see figures watching from the trees. I slept poorly that night, the images of the cabin's interior playing over in my mind. In my dreams, the murmurs returned, louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed to stretch across my bedroom, coiling in corners, gathering at the foot of my bed. I could hear the faint rasp of pages being shifted, whispers rising and falling, as if the cabin itself were breathing. In the weeks after, I avoided the trail, though the memory haunted me constantly. I couldn't forget the smell of herbs and smoke, or the way the air felt thick and alive. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, I swear I can hear faint murmurs carried from some distant hollow, the echo of that day in the cabin following me even when I'm miles away. I never told anyone else about it. People might have called me crazy, and in truth, I couldn't entirely explain what I'd felt. It wasn't fear in the typical sense. It was something deeper, a recognition that some spaces retain the intentions and emotions of those who once occupied them, long after the people themselves have vanished. I think about the trembling message on that scrap of paper often. "Do not disturb what sleeps here." At first I assumed it was a warning against trespass, a threat perhaps left by someone still living in the forest. But now, with distance, I wonder if it was something more. A reminder that certain places are repositories of memory, of devotion, and that disturbing them, even unknowingly, can leave a mark. I never returned to the cabin. The trail is overgrown now, and I've convinced myself that it's probably gone, swallowed by moss and roots. Yet every so often I feel the whispering return, in dreams, in the wind through the hollows, faint but undeniable. The memory is not like a scar, exactly. It is more like a quiet ache, a constant awareness that some parts of the mountains are not just abandoned, but alive with the echoes of those who once called them sacred. Even now, years later, when I'm hiking in quiet areas of the Blue Ridge, I sense it, a presence, subtle but unshakable, that reminds me of that cabin, of the murmured prayers and the small, trembling warnings left behind. It lingers at the edges of perception, a quiet dread that refuses closure. And sometimes, when the wind shifts and the forest exhales through the trees, I think I can hear them again, faint voices carried just beyond reach, reminding me that some things, once disturbed, never truly let go. Story 4. The trail that led nowhere. I set out that morning for a trail I'd never hiked before, craving the kind of solitude you can only find deep in the Blue Ridge. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every step sound loud. Birds called now and then, but their songs felt distant, almost reluctant. About half a mile in, the main trail split into a narrow, overgrown fork I hadn't seen on any map. Curiosity outweighed caution. I had always been drawn to places that felt forgotten, and I followed it. At first, the forest seemed normal, but gradually the trees grew closer, their limbs tangled overhead so that light barely reached the ground. The trail narrowed, roots and rocks catching my boots, and the air thickened, humid and heavy, with a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. I pressed on for what felt like an hour, but something didn't feel right. Every turn seemed to lead me back to the same spot. A particular bend in the trail repeated itself. A twisted root jutting out of the ground, a fallen log in exactly the same place. I paused and looked around, trying to orient myself, but the landscape felt deliberately arranged, almost uncanny. That's when I noticed the first sign. Symbols, crudely carved into tree bark, faint but visible in the dim light. Strange spirals and lines that didn't resemble anything I'd seen in nature or local hiking guides. My stomach turned. Not far from them, half buried in moss and decaying leaves, were old candles, their wax long hardened but still standing upright. Someone had been here, and judging by the careful placement, they had been guiding, or maybe trapping, anyone who wandered too far. Panic began to set in as the sun sank lower, the forest around me taking on a dull, oppressive green. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every whisper of wind against leaves felt intentional. I called out softly, testing the silence, but no answer came, only the rustle of the trees in a way that felt almost deliberate. I tried retracing my steps, but the path seemed to twist back on itself endlessly. My map was useless. The trail didn't exist there. The more I walked, the more I felt the air tighten around me, pressing, suffocating. A low sense of being watched settled in my chest, and I couldn't shake it. Something, or someone, was aware of me. Finally, I broke through the thick brush into a meadow, perfectly clear and empty, with grass that reached mid-calf and no visible trail leading out. It was so still, it felt unreal, like the forest had paused to watch me. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I scanned the tree line, half expecting movement, but there was nothing, only the oppressive hush of twilight settling over the meadow, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves hanging thick in the air. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground, and with a shaking hand I reached for my compass, hoping for some reassurance, but it spun in a slow, mocking circle, useless. Fear took hold fully then, crawling up my spine in a slow, cold wave. I ran blindly, pushing through underbrush, tripping over roots, branches snapping sharply in the silence. My lungs burned, my boots weighed down by the mud, but I couldn't stop. Every instinct screamed that I was being guided, led deeper by unseen hands. Even after I burst back onto a familiar trail, the feeling of being watched never left me. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, tracking me, and the forest seemed to hum around me, an almost imperceptible vibration in the air. I didn't stop running until the trail opened onto a logging road I recognized, my heart hammering, sweat and mud coating my clothes. Even then, the memory of the symbols and the candles lingered in my mind. I couldn't forget the careful arrangement, the impression that I had been allowed a glimpse into something that wanted to remain hidden, something deliberate and patient. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't imagined, keeping secrets, testing boundaries, perhaps even punishing trespassers. That night, I lay in bed, replaying every step. I could still see the twisted tree roots, the faint glow of candle wax, the symbols carved in a pattern that made no sense but felt intentional. The memory pressed against my mind in the quiet, whispering that the forest hadn't finished with me. Even in sleep, I dreamed of being lost. The trees folding around me, the path never straightening, the meadow waiting like a trap at the center of it all. I woke in a cold sweat, convinced I could still hear the faintest sound of rustling leaves behind me. I haven't returned to that trail, and I don't plan to. Even years later, the memory remains vivid. The dense forest, the carved symbols, the candles, and that sense of deliberate presence watching me from the shadows. Sometimes when I hike in other parts of the mountains, I feel it again. A subtle pressure, a chill that doesn't match the wind, a sense that some places are older than we understand, that some paths are meant to lead nowhere but deeper into the unknown. And I know, even now, that the forest doesn't forget. It waits, and it watches. Story 5. Figures dancing in fog. I had set out that morning before sunrise, hoping to catch the ridge trail in the soft glow of early light. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the mist was already gathering in low pockets along the ridges. I'd been hiking these mountains for years, but that day, something felt different. A subtle tension in the air, a thickness to the fog that seemed almost alive. As I rounded a bend, a wall of grey rolled in faster than I expected, swallowing the trail, the trees, and even the distant sounds of birdsong. At first, it was just the fog, shifting and twisting among the trunks, but then I noticed movement, slow, deliberate, circling the ridge's small clearing. Figures, though I couldn't be certain they were people, moved in a careful rhythm, their bodies swaying in unison. The fog dulled their outlines, made their presence surreal, almost dreamlike. My heart began to pound as I crouched behind a thick tree, barely daring to breathe. I could hear a soft chant, low and almost melodic, though the words were incomprehensible. Each movement was precise, practiced, as if part of some ritual older than the mountains themselves. I wanted to call out, to make my presence known, but every instinct screamed against it. The figures' faces were hidden, shrouded in hoods or perhaps shadows cast by the dense fog. Yet I felt it, the sensation of being watched, every one of them aware of me, counting my presence even as I remained still and silent. My stomach twisted, a knot of fear and fascination. Time stretched and compressed, minutes feeling like hours as I watched them dance, the fog swirling around their legs, obscuring and revealing the small clearing in a way that seemed impossible. The air was thick and smelled faintly of damp wood and something herbal, a scent that pricked memories I couldn't place. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures were gone. The chant faded, the fog thinned, and the clearing was empty. No footprints marred the wet earth. No scuffed grass or broken branches suggested anything had been there at all. I stepped forward cautiously, scanning the ground, half expecting to see the remnants of some trace, but there was nothing. I exhaled shakily, convinced I had imagined it, that the early morning light and heavy mist had conspired to play tricks on my eyes. Yet the memory of being watched, of the slow, deliberate rhythm, clung to me like a weight in my chest. I continued down the trail toward the trailhead, moving quickly but trying to remain quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, leaves barely rustling, birds absent from the trees. When I finally emerged onto the gravel road where I had parked, I stopped, gasping, trying to shake the lingering dread. That's when I saw them. Small sticks laid out in a perfect circle in the dirt, just as I had seen in the fog. My breath caught. The circle was modest, nothing elaborate, but it mirrored exactly the formation I had glimpsed earlier. My hands shook, and I stepped closer, half afraid to touch it. Nothing moved, no wind had disturbed the sticks. They were just there, deliberate and impossible to ignore. I drove home with my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting shadows to emerge from the edges of the road. Every bump and curve in the asphalt felt amplified, as though the mountains themselves were watching me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the images over and over, the swaying figures, the rhythm of their movement, the chant carried faintly on the damp morning air, the fog's weight, the smell, the sense that I had been allowed to witness something not meant for human eyes. It pressed against my mind in a way that made my chest ache. In the days that followed, I avoided the ridge trail. Even when I hiked other paths in the mountains, a tight knot of unease remained in my stomach, a constant reminder that some parts of the Blue Ridge are alive in ways we don't understand. I thought about the sticks at the trailhead repeatedly, trying to rationalize them. Perhaps another hiker, some odd tradition I had stumbled upon, a trick of the fog and my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The rhythm, the awareness of those hidden faces, the impossibility of their disappearance, it had been real. Even now, when fog gathers along the ridges in the early morning, I feel the memory return, subtle and insistent. I think about the figures circling and chanting, and the tiny sticks laid out in the dirt, and a shiver runs through me. I never went back to that trail. Never tried to find the clearing again, but the mountains hold their secrets, and sometimes, when the wind shifts and the mist creeps over the ridges, I can almost hear the faint cadence of their chant, just beyond perception, reminding me that some things are never gone, only hidden, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. Story 6. The Forgotten Ritual. Pit I had been following an old logging road deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of road that most people abandoned decades ago. It was overgrown in places, roots and fallen branches forcing me to step carefully, and the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filled the air. I was there to photograph the forest in early autumn, hoping to capture the quiet solitude the mountains offer before the tourist crowds returned. The road twisted between ridges, narrowing to a barely discernible path, until I noticed a depression in the ground off to the side, partially hidden by ferns and low saplings. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet across, but something about its symmetry made it stand out. I knelt beside it and realized it was lined with stones, arranged deliberately, almost like a crude hearth. The center was filled with ash, some blackened and some grey, and scattered among it were fragments of bone and charred remnants of small offerings, wood, herbs, perhaps remnants of food. I could feel it immediately, a lingering heat in the ground that didn't make sense. Nothing had burned here in decades. But the pit radiated a weight, a memory of repeated ceremonies. I leaned closer to examine the remains, my fingers brushing over a splintered piece of wood when the wind shifted, carrying something with it. At first, it was just a sound, low and indistinct, a hum that seemed to vibrate through the stones. Then I realized it was voices, chanting softly, almost imperceptible, a rhythm that didn't belong to any language I knew. My heart leapt into my throat. I stumbled backward, the ground slick with moss, and my camera slipped from my hands, thudding against the dirt. My instinct screamed at me to run, and I did, bolting down the logging road, boots slipping over mud and roots, ears straining for any further sound. The chant faded, swallowed by the trees and distance, but it left a weight behind, pressing in my chest. I made it back to my car as twilight fell, the forest around me growing still and cold. My hands trembled as I tried to collect my scattered gear, the pit and its strange energy burning into my mind. Even hours later, back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that preferred to remain hidden. The image of the stone-lined pit and the remnants of offerings lingered vividly, etched in my memory, and I kept replaying it, wondering how something so small could carry such a powerful presence. That night, as darkness settled over the house, I heard it first as a faint scratch on the windows. Almost like nails dragged across the wood, I froze, listening, heart hammering. It came again, softer, intermittent, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was warning me not to return. I checked the locks, double-checked the windows, but nothing was there. The scratching continued sporadically, a reminder that the pit and its rituals were not gone, that the memory of them lingered in ways I couldn't see or touch. Sleep was fitful, haunted by the sensation of low chants beneath my bed, whispers that seemed to echo from the pit itself, just beyond reach. In the days that followed, I avoided the logging road entirely, even during daylight. I couldn't convince myself that it was just the wind or my imagination. The weight of that place pressed in on me, a tangible force that I felt in my chest whenever I thought about it. I reviewed the few photos I had taken before dropping the camera, but the pit looked unremarkable in them. Ordinary earth and stones that revealed nothing of the presence I had felt. It was as if the forest itself erased the traces, leaving only the memory, and that memory was enough to unsettle me completely. Even now, when I hike in isolated areas or pass old logging roads, I feel the echo of that pit. The faint impression of low chanting, the weight of burned offerings that were long gone, and the sense that something unseen watches anyone who dares approach. I've never gone back, and I never will, but the memory of the forgotten ritual pit has settled in me like a shadow I can't shake. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the night brings it back, a reminder that some places hold devotion, fear, and intent long after the people who once performed them have vanished. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind presses against my windows, I swear I hear that faint scratching again, just beyond the glass. Like a reminder that certain sites are not abandoned. They are patient, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb what sleeps there. The pit exists in my memory now, alive in ways that the eye cannot see, and the knowledge of it lingers, a quiet dread that refuses closure. The mountains hide these remnants well, but they do not forget, and I cannot either. Story 7. Hidden symbols in rock, faces I had been hiking along a ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of narrow path that hugs the edge of steep drops and offers views of the valley below, mist curling in pockets between the trees. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence felt dense, almost heavy, as if the forest were holding its breath. I had walked this trail before, but that day, something drew me closer to the jagged rock faces that jutted out along the ridge. At first, it was nothing more than a vague curiosity, noticing scratches and gouges that I had always assumed were the work of weather or the occasional climbing mishap. But as I moved closer, my attention sharpened, and I saw that the marks were too deliberate, too patterned to be random. I knelt and traced a finger over the grooves, feeling the rough stone beneath my palm. Repeated symbols emerged, spirals, lines intersecting at precise angles, shapes that carried a rhythm, a language I could not read. Tiny handprints were pressed into softer patches of stone, small impressions, some half eroded, some fresh enough to make my stomach twist. My skin prickled with unease. Someone had been here, performing these carvings carefully, away from any eyes that might wander this ridge. There was a sense of ritual about them, a deliberate message left in the stone, layered with intention. Each symbol seemed to thrum with silent energy, like a prayer whispered to the wind, A warning, or perhaps a story etched for someone who understood it. I continued along the ridge, compelled to look for more, each set of carvings drawing me deeper into a quiet tension. The forest around me seemed alive, not in the rustle of leaves or the cry of a bird, but in the hush that fell over the ridgeline, the way the air seemed heavier near the stone. By afternoon, I could feel a subtle vibration in the earth beneath my boots, a resonance that mirrored the rhythm of the carvings. When I set up my camp that night, the images lingered in my mind, sharper than the stars above. In my dreams, the carvings moved. Figures emerged from the rock, people crossing the mountains silently, their whispers threading through the valleys, calling my name in voices I could not understand but felt deep in my chest. I woke before dawn, sweating and tense, the memory of the figure's slow movement pressing against me. Compelled by some mix of dread and curiosity, I returned to the ridge the next morning, retracing my steps. But when I reached the spots where the symbols had been, they were gone, partially erased, as if the carvings had never existed at all. Only faint scratches remained, the impressions blurred by time or perhaps by hands unseen. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone, or something, did not want these marks discovered. The ritual, the message, the prayer, whatever it had been, was meant to be hidden, and I had intruded. As I descended the ridge, the forest seemed more watchful, the air heavier still. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes lingered on me from every shadow, that the carvings had left an impression not just on the rock, but on the mountains themselves. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as though the terrain itself guided me away from certain places. The memory of the tiny handprints pressed in my mind like a warning that some knowledge is not meant for casual discovery, and some rituals are not meant to be witnessed. Even days later, I could feel it in the quiet hours, a subtle pressure in the air, a reminder that the carvings had not been entirely erased. Sometimes, when I hike other ridges or pass cliffs lined with stone, I swear I see the faintest outlines, the traces of marks that vanish when I approach, and I can feel that same quiet, insistent weight of presence, the whispers threading through my thoughts, just beyond comprehension. The memory is like a shadow, stretching and contracting with every wind that passes through the trees, reminding me that the mountains hold their secrets close, and that some of them are patient enough to erase themselves for anyone who is not meant to witness. I have not returned to that particular ridge, though I cannot forget it. The etched symbols, the handprints, the faint whispers in my dreams, they linger in my mind, and sometimes I think I can feel them beneath my skin. A subtle thrum that mirrors the rhythm of the carvings. The mountains themselves seem to carry the memory of those rituals, and I know that some parts of the forest do not forgive intrusion, do not allow witnesses, and certainly do not forget. Even now, when I walk among stone faces or hear the wind moving across a ridge, I feel the weight of their silence, the quiet insistence that some things belong to the mountains alone. And I am left with the unsettling knowledge that what I saw may not have been meant for me, and may never fully disappear from my memory. Story 8. The Watchers on Bald Mountain. I had pitched my small tent on the ridge of Bald Mountain just before sunset, hoping to catch the last light spilling over the Blue Ridge valleys. The mountain was mostly bare, the name Bald earning itself from the lack of trees along the summit, and a cold wind whipped across the rocks, carrying with it the smell of wet moss and the distant pines below. I was alone, save for the occasional call of a crow, and the stillness of the ridge felt almost sacred, the kind of isolation that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the sky turned an angry orange and then deep violet, and a chill pressed against my skin. That's when I heard it, a low hum, subtle at first, vibrating along the ridge and curling through the rocks like it belonged to the mountain itself. I told myself it was the wind, whistling over some hollow crevice, but the sound didn't shift or waver the way wind usually does. It was steady, almost deliberate, and it carried with it a weight that settled into my chest. I stepped from the tent to investigate, scanning the horizon. At first, I saw nothing, only the silhouettes of distant ridges folding into one another. Then I noticed figures, standing at the edge of the far ridge, perfectly still. They were far enough that I couldn't make out details, but their stance was rigid, unnaturally precise. My stomach tightened because though they were distant, I felt it, the unmistakable sense that they were aware of me, that their gaze travelled the miles across the valley and fixed itself on me. I froze, wanting to believe it was a trick of the light or the lingering dusk haze, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Every muscle in my body tensed, a cold, sharp dread spreading from my spine into my limbs. I thought of quietly packing and leaving, hoping that if I moved slowly, I could escape without drawing attention. But as I descended the ridge, the path seemed to stretch unnaturally, each bend taking longer than it should have, the familiar turns of the trail warping under my anxious gaze. My heart hammered, and every rustle in the scrub and rock made me jerk my head, convinced I glimpsed movement where there was none. The hum persisted, low and insistent, threading through the air and pressing against my ears. At moments, it seemed to take on a rhythm, like the faint echo of voices just beneath hearing, but I never caught words, only that vibration that set my teeth on edge. I dared not look back too often, afraid of confirming the impossible, that the figures were following, that their awareness extended beyond the ridge and into the winding path I was now clumsily navigating. Each step was careful but desperate. My boots slid against mossy stones, my fingers clutching roots and rocks for balance, but still I couldn't shake the impression that someone, something, was measuring me. Hours, or what felt like hours, though it may have been minutes, passed as I stumbled through the ridge trail. Finally, the familiar gravel of the forest road came into view, and relief flooded me so sharply I nearly fell over. My breath came in shallow gasps, chest tight, mind racing with the impossibility of what I had seen. I paused at my car, sweating and shaking, hands fumbling with the keys. A final glance at the horizon made my blood run cold. The figures were gone, vanished as if they had never existed. The ridge was empty, the twilight settling into night, but the hum remained. Even across the distance, it clung to my ears and pressed into my skull. A persistent memory of presence that refused to leave. Driving down the mountain, I felt haunted by it, the way a sound or image lingers long after it disappears. Streetlights and familiar roads did nothing to soothe me. Every darkened tree line on the outskirts of towns made my pulse spike, reminding me that the watchers may not be confined to that ridge. That low hum, their imprint on the air, followed me into the quiet of my apartment, echoing in my dreams, blending with the wind outside my windows. At times, I thought I could see figures in distant hills or shadows that seemed too rigid to belong to the natural world, and the dread returned with the same intensity. I never returned to Bull Mountain. The experience left an indelible mark, an understanding that some ridges hold attention, that some presences are patient and unseen. The hum, faint but constant in memory, reminds me that observation does not require proximity, that awareness can stretch across distances, and that solitude in these mountains is never truly solitary. Every so often, when wind presses against my windows or fog drifts along the nearest ridge, I remember the figures, perfectly still against the horizon, and the memory of their gaze presses down, unyielding. Even with time, the sense of being watched lingers. It is subtle, but persistent, like a shadow folded into the corners of my awareness, a reminder that some mountains have eyes, and that the hum, like memory itself, can never fully be silenced. I recount the story carefully, knowing disbelief will greet it, yet the dread remains as real as the cold wind that first carried that low, insistent sound across Bald Mountain. I cannot explain what I saw, only that it exists, and it is patient, waiting, and aware in ways I do not understand. Story 9. Smoke, rising from hidden clearings. I had been hiking alone along a narrow ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The kind of trail that snakes along sharp drops with nothing but mist and distant valleys for company. The day was overcast, and the clouds pressed low against the mountain tops, muting the colors of the forest and giving everything a washed-out, almost unreal tone. I was enjoying the quiet, the way the wind moved through the pines, carrying that earthy scent of damp moss and fallen leaves, until the breeze shifted and brought with it a new sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. Whispers, soft and rhythmic, seemed to emerge from behind the rocks that jutted along the ridge. They were almost musical, a pattern to the tones that suggested intention, yet the words were not in any language I recognized. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, passing over cracks in the stone or rustling the trees in a way that tricked the ear. But as I continued along the trail, the whispers grew louder, pressing against the edges of perception. Curling around the rocks and reaching toward me, shadows flickered at the corners of my eyes, elongated and distorted, forming shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. My stomach tightened, a cold, crawling sensation running up my spine. I tried to focus on the trail beneath my boots, counting steps, listening to my breath, anything to keep my mind anchored, but the whispers were patient, persistent, following me as though the ridge itself were alive. The trail began to feel different. Familiar markers, the twist of a tree branch, the slope of the rocks, all seemed subtly wrong, as if I had never been here before. Panic nudged at the edges of reason. I tried to climb higher, hoping the ridge's summit would bring clarity, but the whispers rose with me, more insistent, weaving a rhythm into my thoughts. My head ached as I strained to identify a source, and that's when I noticed the shapes again, shadows moving between the boulders, not fully separate from the rock itself, yet distinct enough to make me flinch. I dared not look directly for more than a moment, afraid to confirm the impossible, afraid to see something that should not exist. Hours, or perhaps only minutes. Time became strange under the pressure of the whispers, passed as I pressed forward. I began to realize I had left the trail entirely. The ridge no longer followed the familiar curves I knew, the landscape shifting around me in a way that defied memory. I stumbled over roots and stones, heart hammering, desperate to find something recognizable, anything that could guide me back. The whispers did not relent. They threaded through the pines, dancing over the rocks, teasing and beckoning with the same strange melodic cadence. It was almost hypnotic, like a lullaby sung in a language meant to disorient. Eventually, the ridge leveled out into a plateau I did not recognize. The clouds above had darkened further, and the mist hung low, obscuring distant ridges that might have served as landmarks. I realized I was alone in a place I could not name, with no sense of direction or time. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but there was nothing to trace my steps by. The wind shifted again, and the whispers were gone, leaving only the low hum of the ridge and the weight of my own pulse in my ears. I sank to a rock, trying to collect my thoughts. And that's when I understood the full scope of what had happened. I had been guided, or perhaps trapped, by something unseen, something that knew how to bend perception and time. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a faint path winding down the slope. It wasn't the trail I had started on, and yet I followed it with the desperation of someone fleeing unseen eyes. The forest thickened around me, the low mist curling over the roots and rocks like smoke. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed shadows moving just beyond my vision, lingering long enough to set my teeth on edge. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, carrying that faint echo of whispers from earlier, teasing the memory of what I had heard. When I finally emerged near a small creek, far below any point I'd recognized, relief washed over me, but only briefly. The ridge above seemed ordinary again, silent in a way that contrasted sharply with the oppressive presence I had experienced. Yet the memory remained, embedded deep in my mind. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being guided or watched. They followed me for days after, surfacing in quiet moments when the wind rattled the window panes, or when I closed my eyes at night. I could still hear them faintly, just beyond comprehension, carrying the rhythm and cadence of that unearthly song. I haven't returned to that ridge, nor do I plan to, yet the memory clings, unyielding. The whispers behind the rocks, the strange shapes at the edges of my vision, the impossible trail that twisted me into unfamiliar territory, they linger in the folds of my mind, a quiet dread that hums beneath the surface of daily life. The ridge has left its mark, a reminder that the mountains are patient and observant, that solitude is not always safety, and that some sounds, some presences, refuse to fade even when the eye no longer sees them. Story 10. Whispers Behind the Ridge. I had been hiking alone along a narrow ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of trail that snakes along sharp drops with nothing but mist and distant valleys for company. The day was overcast, and the clouds pressed low against the mountain tops, muting the colors of the forest and giving everything a washed-out, almost unreal tone. I was enjoying the quiet, the way the wind moved through the pines, carrying that earthy scent of damp moss and fallen leaves, until the breeze shifted and brought with it a new sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable, whispers, soft and rhythmic, seemed to emerge from behind the rocks that jutted along the ridge. They were almost musical, a pattern to the tones that suggested intention, yet the words were not in any language I recognized. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, passing over cracks in the stone or rustling the trees in a way that tricked the ear. But as I continued along the trail, the whispers grew louder, pressing against the edges of perception, curling around the rocks and reaching toward me. Shadows flickered at the corners of my eyes, elongated and distorted, forming shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. My stomach tightened, a cold, crawling sensation running up my spine. I tried to focus on the trail beneath my boots, counting steps, listening to my breath, anything to keep my mind anchored, but the whispers were patient, persistent, following me as though the ridge itself were alive. The trail began to feel different. Familiar markers, the twist of a tree branch, the slope of the rocks, all seemed subtly wrong, as if I had never been here before. Panic nudged at the edges of reason. I tried to climb higher, hoping the ridge's summit would bring clarity, but the whispers rose with me, more insistent, weaving a rhythm into my thoughts. My head ached as I strained to identify a source, and that's when I noticed the shapes again, shadows moving between the boulders, not fully separate from the rock itself, yet distinct enough to make me flinch. I dared not look directly for more than a moment, afraid to confirm the impossible, afraid to see something that should not exist. Hours, or perhaps only minutes, Time became strange under the pressure of the whispers, passed as I pressed forward. I began to realize I had left the trail entirely. The ridge no longer followed the familiar curves I knew, the landscape shifting around me in a way that defied memory. I stumbled over roots and stones, heart hammering, desperate to find something recognizable, anything that could guide me back. The whispers did not relent. They threaded through the pines, dancing over the rocks, teasing and beckoning with the same strange melodic cadence. It was almost hypnotic, like a lullaby sung in a language meant to disorient. Eventually, the ridge leveled out into a plateau I did not recognize. The clouds above had darkened further, and the mist hung low, obscuring distant ridges that might have served as landmarks. I realized I was alone in a place I could not name, with no sense of direction or time. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but there was nothing to trace my steps by. The wind shifted again, and the whispers were gone, leaving only the low hum of the ridge and the weight of my own pulse in my ears. I sank to a rock, trying to collect my thoughts, and that's when I understood the full scope of what had happened. I had been guided, or perhaps trapped, by something unseen, something that knew how to bend perception and time. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a faint path winding down the slope. It wasn't the trail I had started on, and yet I followed it with the desperation of someone fleeing unseen eyes. The forest thickened around me, the low mist curling over the roots and rocks like smoke. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed shadows moving just beyond my vision, lingering long enough to set my teeth on edge. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, carrying that faint echo of whispers from earlier, teasing the memory of what I had heard. When I finally emerged near a small creek, far below any point I had recognized, relief washed over me, but only briefly. The ridge above seemed ordinary again, silent in a way that contrasted sharply with the oppressive presence I had experienced. Yet the memory remained, embedded deep in my mind. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being guided or watched. They followed me for days after, surfacing in quiet moments when the wind rattled the window panes, or when I closed my eyes at night. I could still hear them faintly, just beyond comprehension, carrying the rhythm and cadence of that unearthly song. I haven't returned to that ridge, nor do I plan to yet. The memory clings, unyielding, the whispers behind the rocks, the strange shapes at the edges of my vision, the impossible trail that twisted me into unfamiliar territory. They linger in the folds of my mind, a quiet dread that hums beneath the surface of daily life. The ridge has left its mark, a reminder that the mountains are patient and observant. That solitude is not always safety, and that some sounds, some presences, refuse to fade even when the eye no longer sees them. Story 11. The Vanishing Stone Circle. I had been hiking in a remote section of the forest I'd never explored, the kind of place where the trees crowd close together, their roots twisting over each other like the veins of some ancient organism. The air was damp, thick with moss and the scent of decaying leaves, and the sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy. I was moving slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, listening to the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, when I came across something that made me stop cold. There, nestled in a small clearing, was a perfect circle of stones, each moss-covered and darkened by time, arranged so precisely it seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. My chest tightened. It was the kind of symmetry you don't stumble upon by accident. I approached cautiously, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet. The center of the circle felt wrong, unnaturally cold, a chill that pricked at my fingertips as I reached out to touch one of the stones. I lifted my camera to take a photo, hesitant, wanting to capture it, to prove that I had actually seen this. And in the brief moments I adjusted the lens, something shifted in my peripheral vision. I froze. When I looked back, several stones were no longer where they had been. One had vanished entirely, and another had moved a foot or more from its original place. My stomach dropped, a shiver running up my spine. I backed away slowly, eyes scanning the surrounding trees, expecting movement, a figure, some explanation for the impossible. There was nothing, only the whisper of leaves in the wind, the occasional call of a distant bird. But the feeling persisted, that the circle was aware, active, responsive to my presence. My rational mind tried to insist it was a trick of perspective, shadows shifting in the afternoon light, but the sensation of being watched, of something adjusting itself while I wasn't looking, was undeniable. I left the clearing as quickly as I could without running, retracing my steps through the dense undergrowth, all the while glancing over my shoulder. By the time I returned to the small cabin I had rented for the weekend, the forest felt different, heavier, as if the trees themselves carried knowledge of what I had seen. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the circle from my mind. Shadows moved outside the cabin window, elongated and twitching in the wind, and every creak of the wooden walls made me jump. The memory of the shifting stones pressed against my thoughts, making it impossible to sleep. In the darkness, I dreamed of the circle. The stones moved in patterns I didn't understand, forming shapes that seemed to pulse with intent. In the center, I felt that unnatural cold again, deeper, as if it extended into the very marrow of my bones. Whispered voices, unintelligible yet insistent, threaded through the dream, guiding my steps toward the circle, pulling me closer despite my terror. I woke with a start, sweat beading on my forehead, heart hammering. Outside, the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, dancing in the corners of my vision. The next day, I returned to the forest. Driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, I needed to see the circle again, to understand whether I had imagined the shifting stones. But when I reached the clearing, the stones were gone, leaving only the uneven ground where moss and dirt had been disturbed. No trace remained of the precise arrangement, no hint that it had ever existed, save for the lingering chill in the air and the echo of the memory that refused to fade. Panic set in, and I fled the forest, heart racing, head whipping from side to side, imagining shadows between the trees. Even now, weeks later, I feel its presence. When I close my eyes, the stones return in shifting patterns, cold and alive. Shadows move at the edges of my vision, subtle but insistent, and I sense awareness in the forest that I cannot name. The circle has left a mark, an imprint in memory and bone, a reminder that some places are not static, that some formations are not merely objects but participants in something beyond comprehension. I cannot explain it, and I cannot return. Yet the image lingers, gnawing at the edges of consciousness, leaving me uncertain whether I was ever truly alone in that forest, or if the circle in some way remains aware of me still. Story 12. Echoes of forgotten devotion. I had set out that afternoon to follow an unmarked trail, one that wound through the denser sections of the Blue Ridge Mountains, places where even locals hesitated to go. The air was heavy with humidity, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss, and the forest seemed to close in around me as the path narrowed. I had been walking for hours, the sunlight dimming through the thick canopy, when I stumbled upon a clearing that made me pause. It was small, circular, and at first glance ordinary, but then I noticed the wooden figures standing in deliberate positions, their forms faded, cracked, and worn from years of exposure. Each idol was carved crudely but with care, their shapes suggesting human figures, animals, and shapes I could not name. Something about the arrangement made my stomach tighten. They were not random. Someone, or something, had placed them here with purpose, in patterns that suggested devotion or ritual. As I stepped closer, the hairs on my arms prickled. The air in the clearing felt colder than the surrounding forest, as though the stones and earth had absorbed some lingering intent. I had no camera with me, no way to record what I was seeing, and yet I felt compelled to study the arrangement, to understand its meaning. That's when I realized I was not entirely alone. I could feel eyes on me, or perhaps that was just the memory of devotion that clung to the place, pressing against my senses. Then I heard it, a faint chanting, soft, rhythmic, almost musical, drifting across the clearing on the wind. It was barely audible, but unmistakable, syllables repeated in patterns that suggested ceremony. My heart jumped, and I spun around, expecting to see someone hidden among the trees, but there was nothing, only the swaying of branches and the distant call of a bird breaking the stillness. I wanted to leave immediately, yet my curiosity anchored me in place. Each idol seemed to exude presence, a weight that made it impossible to look away. I traced the carvings with my eyes, noting the weathered features, the small cracks that had formed over decades, and the occasional symbol etched into the wood that looked older than the figures themselves. It was as though the clearing had absorbed countless years of attention, devotion, perhaps even fear. The chanting continued, faint and persistent, and I could not tell if it came from far away or from inside my own mind. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the shadows seemed to shift subtly, elongating toward me, retreating when I turned my head. Night was falling faster than I realized. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the surrounding trees, carrying the chanting with it in a way that made it both clearer and more haunting. The shadows deepened, and I suddenly understood the danger of staying any longer. I turned, moving quickly, almost running, through the narrowing trail, but the sound followed me, threading through the trees and brushing against my consciousness. I did not look back until I reached a bend in the trail where the forest opened slightly, and even then, the clearing was just a whisper in the distance, indistinct yet impossibly present. Even after I returned to my cabin and later to town, the memory of the clearing haunted me. The chanting lingered in the edges of my hearing, the pattern of devotion seeming to echo in my thoughts, recurring at random moments. I would be sitting at my desk, walking down a quiet street, or lying in bed, and the same soft, repetitive rhythm would begin, indistinguishable from memory, yet pressing like a tangible presence. I tried to rationalize it. The wind, my imagination, some residual sound bouncing through the mountains, but that felt too simple, too easy. The clearing had left a mark, something persistent and insistent that refused to be ignored. I never returned to that trail, and I doubt I will. The forest holds many secrets, but that clearing felt alive in a way that went beyond natural phenomena. Someone had once performed their devotions there, leaving a lingering imprint that had survived weather, decay, and time. The idols, cracked and worn, still seemed to watch, to hold vigil for reasons I could not understand. And the chanting, whether real or conjured by memory, had taught me a lesson I could not shake. Some places carry the weight of attention long after the ones who gave it are gone, and their echoes are not so easily dismissed. Even now, months later, I catch myself imagining the clearing whenever I am alone in the woods or walking along a quiet ridge. The idols appear in the corners of my vision, their presence insistent yet subtle, and I hear the faint whisper of voices in my memory, drifting like smoke over distant treetops. I do not know who or what once tended to that space, nor why the echoes remain, but I feel certain that the forest preserves their devotion, carrying it forward in ways I cannot fully comprehend. There is a quiet terror in realizing that some places are not empty, that even abandoned rituals leave traces of consciousness behind, and that the mountains remember.